Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues.
Ja ću samo jednu sekundu. Dear friends, actually, welcome to the small tribune, small forum of Institute of European Studies. Actually, we had the idea to make a little bit smaller conversation, but actually, as it showed up, people are very interested. And of course, as we all know, we had midterms happening this night actually. So I think it's really more than a good occasion to welcome our long friend and two times before this also our guest, Mr. George Jatras. And I will not take more of your time. I asked Professor Srđa Trifković, who actually facilitated the whole this event. I have to thank him quite a lot for this, to actually lead the whole thing, and I do believe that it's going to be a very interesting lecture, and after that debate that we could ask about what is really happening in the world. Anyway, please go on.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I first of all need to warn Misha that it is very dangerous to let anyone lead the whole thing, even for a while, because it is a sure way to undermine one's control over the institution. But my pleasure and privilege in presenting yet again my friend of over 2 decades, James George Jatras, who is a jack of many trades and a master of all of them, who has been
flattery
over a long life, almost as long as mine, a diplomat, an analyst with the U.S. Senate Republican Policy Committee for over a decade, right?
17 years.
17 years.
Yeah.
And then a lobbyist, first with a big Washingtonian firm, actually two of them in succession, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then independent, during which time he also was the founder of the American Council for Kosovo, which was a lobbying tool of sorts, but also a research institution which facilitated the presentation of the, to put it in shorthand, the Serbian view of the Kosovo events. And it was an endeavor blessed by the late Bishop Artemije. Now, Mr. Jatras is a gentleman farmer in deep Virginia, where I had the pleasure of visiting him twice, last year for Thanksgiving and last spring. And I think it's the place where you will find more empty shells from different caliber light weapons than anywhere north of the Dixon-Mason line. In fact, I think that 2 days before last year's Thanksgiving, we spent about 4,000 pieces of ammo from .22 to .45 or thereabouts.
Including full automatic, which in Virginia is totally legal with the right paperwork. It's
yeah, just you go play with you remember what was the last time you were in?
Yes, my experience on the boat in the Bronx, yes. Before I give the word to Jim, I have to tell you what happened to me during this unpleasant experience. I was arrested at LaGuardia Airport because I had a high-capacity clip, which is banned only in 2 states, in California and in New York. I was taken to the jail on the boat in the Bronx, the only white person in a 48-person dormitory, where my nickname immediately became Papa, because I was also the oldest. And where I survived, among other things, by beating the senior African-American criminal in attendance in 3 successive games of chess, where he said, "Ooh, Papa sure knows this game." And from that moment, my street cred with... However, I couldn't communicate with the outside world because I didn't have my cell phone with me, and the only number I knew by heart was 202-375.
Hey, not out loud. It's being recorded. It's being recorded.
And you
don't dox me, bro.
You record your own name, Srđa
Yeah.
Trifković, and then the recipient of the call gets the pre-recorded message. This is the New York Department
Well,
of
it was more like.
Corrections.
That's what more like what sounded
and
like.
then, will you accept the call from Srđa Trifković? If so, please key in your credit card number. Whereupon Mr. Jatras, to his everlasting credit, decided that this is a fraudulent call, which has the objective and
stealing my credit card
put
number.
down the phone. And I said, no, this is well. How I got out of this mess is a long story. Suffice to say that my prison experience in the U.S. exceeds anyone else's in this room. At least I hope. Maybe.
Samo, izvinjam se, molim vas isključite telefone da se ne čuje ništa ovdje. Sorry.
So, without ado, the analyst par excellence and the Renaissance man without rival, James Jatras.
Thank you. As a unreconstructed East Roman partisan, I'm not sure I agree with this Renaissance man thing, but I suppose I will tolerate it for the moment.
Well, Renaissance, like those exiles from Constantinople who established themselves in Florence.
I must say, I was almost tempted to cancel my appearance today when I saw the announcement was in Latinica instead of Chirilica, but being from the Institute. But since I'm an open-minded, tolerant person, I will continue. Thank you, Dr. Trifković. Thank you, Misha. I really appreciate this. The topic today is what the American Empire, we call it the global American Empire, the GAY for short. And the question is whether we are nearing a triumph of that empire or some soon collapse or end to that empire, what the consequences of that would be. I think in order to examine that, we need to look at three things. One would be what's happening in the United States itself. As noted, we had our election yesterday, although the way American elections go nowadays, they go on for days, weeks before they're resolved. I think this has become unique now in the so-called developed world where you can't have a normal election where you know the results that night or at least by the next day, and these things go on forever. We'll talk about that.
This is not the country. You should speak like that.
Oh, okay. You have the same problem here? You have mail-in ballots?
No.
Do you have early voting? Do you have any of that nonsense?
You wait for a very long time to get the results, actually. So it's the global trend.
Well, this is more exporting of American democracy, I guess. And then, of course, we then looking at the initial international situation. Clearly, the war in Ukraine is the main ring of the circus at the moment, and then we can talk about what the broader consequences of that are. I do hope we can make this somewhat of a discussion rather than my just droning on for 40 minutes and then asking questions. I'm sure Dr. Trifković can overcome his customary reticence to volunteer a comment here and then.
This will be a Socratic event.
I see. So
you're Socrates.
If you would like to prompt with questions or things that I may have omitted, feel free to do so. And if anybody else wants to throw anything in the course of my remarks, saying, yes, I agree with that, or no, you're stupid, or let me add this, please just throw your hand up and let's just join the conversation.
Just for as long as you refrain from insensitive and hurtful and just so wrong comments.
I was intending to direct my remarks solely in that direction, so I hope that won't disappoint anybody. Well, let's just jump right in. As noted, we had an election yesterday. I'm sure most of you are aware with the rather peculiar constitutional arrangement we have with these so-called off-year elections midway through a presidential term. By all indications, the Republicans should have done very well in these elections. The inflation is up by all the polling. That's the number one concern people have. We also have the bizarre phenomenon of the Democratic Party just doubling down on all the craziness in our country today, whether it's an open border, whether it's cutting genitals off kids and transitions to the other sex, drag queen shows suitable for the whole family. Who is it? I think it was the Attorney General of Michigan a few days ago said that there should be a drag queen in every school. Instead of a chicken in every pot, as used to be the promise of presidents, now it's a drag queen in every school. So the loony left, as the British have called it for years, has completely taken over America, and it's not even left anymore. It's simply insanity, and this is plain for any normal person to see, no matter what your politics may be somewhere on the political spectrum. So by all indications, the Republicans should have done well yesterday. What we're seeing this morning, it seems they did not. And that relates to what we opened the discussion with. Rather than knowing election results on the night of the election, as was customary in the United States for many, many years, we had seen, really starting in 2018 with the off-year election then during Trump's administration, and then, of course, again with a vengeance in 2020 during the presidential election, what some people have called the red mirage and the blue shift, which means that on election night, the conventional wisdom being that most Republicans, or let's say disproportionately Republicans, vote in person on election day, but Democrats, especially during all the COVID nonsense, tended to vote more by mail or through early voting, that you would have an apparent Republican victory, which would then melt away days or even weeks later, as they just miraculously happened to find boxes of ballots with the overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate.
Can you just mention briefly the practice of ballot harvesting for postal votes?
Yes. There's this peculiar practice, as Srđa says, ballot harvesting, we have in many but not all states, where a private individual can collect the ballots from a number of voters. Instead of having them deposited directly in a repository for ballots or being even sent through the mail, a person will go around collecting the ballots from individuals and will take them in a bundle to the polling place, and in some cases they even provide assistance to the voter, whether they're maybe not very proficient in English or maybe their health is bad and so forth. Here, I'll help you fill out the ballot, and there's really no control over what this person is exactly doing. Who are these ballots? Where are they coming from? And whether they can even add more ballots to them in the course of doing this. From the point of view of those of us who are in favor of what they call ballot security, it's an open invitation to fraud. It's become rampant.
Ballot security has become the code word for the accusation of racism, discriminationism.
Exactly right. And of course, even today, I was on debate on Press TV last night, an Iranian channel, with some lefty type who was saying that the real story in our elections is the repression of legitimate votes, of minority voters, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is an indication. The whole discussion of something like ballot security. By the way, even something as simple as voter ID, being able to present an identification to show who you are when you vote, is racist and discriminatory now, much less even showing that you're a citizen when you register to vote. When you register to vote, you simply check a box swearing that you're a citizen under penalty of law, but nobody's ever going to check and ask your paperwork to show you actually are a citizen when you register. So it's well known that we have many, many non-citizens, not just illegal aliens, but even legal aliens who are not entitled to vote, casting ballots in our elections, and nothing is done about it. You had a thought. I can see it on your face.
Yeah. When did this start, this process of ballot harvesting?
That's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to that.
I think it's been around for a long while, but it was initially meant only for genuinely disabled people, people who are unable to make the trip to...
It was a small-scale thing. It was not a significant element in the thing. And back when we were a higher trust society, that it wasn't really a problem. Nobody really suspected that the funny business was going on, and in most cases, it's unlikely that there was.
But now, and I need to be maybe a little bit more frank than Jim, who is now unusually reticent about calling a spade a spade. This is really the way to make sure that stoned and hung over young blacks cast their votes, because they simply don't bother to go out and vote. And we are talking about perhaps a few million votes from the ghettos, from West LA to South Chicago to other pleasant parts of the country. And yeah,
for how much percent, if it's few million votes, or covered by this system, or this distant, not distant, but the collective vote, how non-numeric, I don't know, 3% for how many votes?
well, in critical states.
Well, see, that depends. But remember, we don't have national elections. There's no national election ever in the United States. Even the presidential election is not a national election. It's an election in individual states to see if those states' electors' votes will go to a given candidate. So you don't have to worry about what percentage of the national vote it is. You only need to make sure you carry, let's take Pennsylvania, a critical state in a presidential year, that if you can make sure you get enough votes in Philadelphia, which has a Democratic machine, very heavily dependent on black votes in Philadelphia,
and on abuse.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just notorious for its levels of fraud. If you can pile up enough votes in Philadelphia, you can win Pennsylvania. As you win Pennsylvania, you can win the presidential election. You don't care what percent those votes are in the
And the same applies to Milwaukee in Wisconsin, to Detroit in
Atlanta and Georgia,
and to Phoenix in Arizona.
Yeah, and of course you have to add to this too that the margin you need to turn an election one way or the other shifts each year with demographic change in the United States. Let's remember, one of the hallmarks of the current democratic regime is basically open borders and all sorts of people coming in. We don't even know who the hell they are. And we're talking about millions of people at this point that are just entering the country. So that means if you look at American demographically in terms of ethno-racial groups, to win an election generally you need between 65 and 70% of the white vote. About a third of Asians and Hispanics tend to vote Republican, and about 1/10 of blacks will vote Republican. But with each year, as the demography of America changes, that means that you need not 70% of the white vote, you need 72% of the white vote, or 73% of the vote, depending on the locality. So that shifts as well. Now, sometimes when for example, when the Democrats are becoming so crazy on things like sexual issues, or crime, you get maybe more Hispanic voters voting for the Republicans, which I think is a good thing, marginally speaking, because Republicans aren't the solution either. We can discuss that as well.
In the United States, people of our ilk tend to divide the political scene into the stupid party and the evil party. I leave to you to guess which is which.
Yeah, and if something is really evil and stupid, we call that bipartisan. So in any case, but even there, you're talking about with the Hispanic vote maybe going from 30% of the vote to 33 or 34, even maybe 35% of the vote. You're still losing the majority of that vote. So the demographic shift continues. It puts the Republicans in an impossible situation. But since they're afraid of being called racists, they never will do anything about any of these things, even when they have the political power to do so. Rather, they would chase the specter, saying, but if we just try harder, if we just soften our positions, we can get more minority votes. And so, that's what we saw with now in Georgia, where a black football star is the Republican nominee against a radically left black minister. That's the only way Republicans now think they can win an election. And maybe they're getting to the point where that's right, where they simply don't have a self-aware core American ethnos that has any sense of its identity or its interest in its own country anymore.
It's legit to talk about Latino vote, black vote, Asian American, but not white.
The only two politicians who've ever said anything about white voters or white workers are Andrew Yang, who's Asian, and Tulsi Gabbard, who's was she part Samoan and part Indian, or I don't know what she is exactly.
Pacific Islander.
So, but certainly no white politician would ever talk about it because it would be racist to do so. But they openly talk about black votes, brown votes, yellow votes, whatever it's going to be. It's it's part of the just sort of the taboos in American politics nowadays.
We can move to the effect of these elections on the imperial province.
Well, we will, but just very briefly, just to finish off what the significance of these elections are. If we were going to see any hope that a real shift would be seen against the Democrats, there should have been a huge wave of red win last night, Republican win last night, which we would see some of it dribbling away in the subsequent days. We did not see that big wave last night. If you look at some of the close races, like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania losing against a guy who's not even functional cognitively anymore following a stroke, Oz lost. If you look even at some of these very unpopular governors in places like New York and Michigan, which, I admit it was an outside chance a Republican win, but they could possibly have won. They didn't win either. So even in the district in Virginia where I live, where we have a CIA officer woman who is the Democratic incumbent being challenged by a very credible Latina Republican police officer that had a lot of popular following, a huge popular following. Evidently, it's already reported that the incumbent already won that, and it was a very closely contested race. So it looks like a lot of the close races that the Republicans should have won in a blowout year have already been lost now. That doesn't portend well for what will happen over the next few days. This is important, as Srđa says, shifting over to the global picture. There are some people, some of you may see the videos of Alexander Mercouris online about what's going on in Ukraine, how it's playing politically in the rest of the world. And I respect Alexander's views very much, but he seems to think that the change will come more in America than it will come in Europe. And the fact is, nothing will change our foreign policy based on any increase in Republican strength in the Congress. At this point, if I still had to guess, the Republicans will probably still take the House, but by a much smaller margin, maybe a razor-thin margin.
But not the Senate.
But not the Senate. And even if they do, that'll only be one or two seats majority, and that means, of course, the Democrats will still have blocking straight there. But even if the Republicans got complete control of Congress, that would not really change our foreign policy, because the leadership of the Republicans in both the House and the Senate is as militantly anti-Russian, more support for Ukraine, more money. In fact, their only criticism of the Biden administration is they're not giving more money and more weapons to Ukraine than they are, that they're not being more confrontational with Moscow than they are. True, we'll probably get some more sort of populist, Trump-type Republicans elected in both the House and the Senate, but they'll still be a tiny minority of the Republican office holders in those bodies, which means that the leadership will be in lockstep with the Democrats in this march toward whatever disaster awaits us in the world. So I think that covers the domestic part of it. Shifting over briefly, we have to talk a little bit about, okay, what in the wide world of sports is going on in Ukraine.
But before you do that, can you just say very briefly whether, if the Republicans do have the control, what can they do with the issues that really worry Americans, like crime, immigration, gun control?
Short answer is not much. That even if they controlled the House by a significant margin, which I don't think they will, even if they controlled the Senate, and as I say, they still would not have what they call cloture strength, a supermajority, which is necessary to get legislation through the Senate, and of course they don't control the White House, that they would not be able to affect anything positively through the political system. At best, what they could do is hold up things that the Democrats want to pass through Congress. But Mr. Biden, or whatever is controlling the levers of the husk of Mr. Biden, has made it clear he wants to essentially rule by decree anyway through executive orders. So in terms of the things that matter on inflation or on war or on the border or any of those things, crime, all of these things, he's essentially ruling as a dictator and getting away with it. The Republicans could impeach him. but they can't remove him because they can't get it through the Senate. And even if they did manage to get rid of him, what's waiting in the wings? That cackling idiot we have as vice president, who, in fact, I did a poll on Twitter last night, is that if Biden goes and the cackling idiot becomes president, would it make things worse? Would it make things better? Would it be about the same? Or just shoot me, please? And the clear winner was just shoot me, please, on that poll. So I don't think, yeah.
Excuse me. When we are speaking about the issues that were very hot about, the crime was actually beside inflation mentioned as number one.
Yes.
So, I mean, of course, we know that American society is, very diverse. There's a lot of things. But how it happened actually, in which measures are we speaking when we speak about the rise of criminality in the last, 4 or 5 years or whatsoever? In the last 2, actually, the people perceive this so big issue. Could you explain us what really happened? Why the crime became so important in these elections?
Well, some of it has to do with you recall the riots that took place in 2020, the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd and all this. Again, this is something you really can't talk about in the United States, but a huge percentage of crime in the United States is committed by black people. I mean, obviously, I would say the vast majority of black people are normal, law-abiding people, but in terms of the minority of any community that commits violent crime, they've got a much bigger problem in their community than you do in other demographic groups.
I'm sorry, I have to emphasize that straight black males between the age of 16 and 35 are not quite in accordance with what you described. Vast majority are law-abiding and so on. In fact, over 1/2 of young black males of this age group will be at some point
in the criminal justice system.
In the criminal justice
That's true.
system.
That's true. I was saying if you take the black community as a whole, females, old people, young people, and all that. In any case, because now there's a kind of a presumption of racism, of normal enforcement of the law in many areas. For example, there are many offenses like what they call turnstile jumping, like if you jump into the metro without paying the fare, or if you're driving with your taillights out on your car, or many other things that the police would routinely stop you for. That they're not actionable anymore. They've simply stopped enforcing them. In many of the American cities now, they have turned into essentially citation offenses, where they just give you a ticket, any like a theft below $1,000. So now you have gangs coming into stores and just go in there and loot the place, walk out as brazen as you please, with nobody stopping them, no consequences whatsoever. And of course, when you allow that kind of thing, what you end up with is, there's what they call the broken window theory of criminality, which is when people see broken windows on the street and they say, hey, the laws are not being enforced here, I can do what I want. That then feeds the attitude you can engage in other crimes, including violent crimes, without any real consequences. And the police in many of these areas, especially in areas where there are a lot of black people, have learned, I better not get involved because they're not going to go to jail. I'm going to go to jail if I try to do my job. So this is contributing to a riot. Now a lot of this is in the urban areas, but like many things, this tends to then spread out from the urban areas into the suburban areas and then even to the countryside. So that's where I think you're seeing the concerns being expressed in the polling data.
And since you're talking about law enforcement, exactly a year ago, you had a debate with my son over whether, if push comes to shove, will the law enforcement act against their own people? And that might be worth mentioning.
Well, I think that's something we talk about further in the discussion, that when things break down in America in a very fundamental way, and I think they will do so, and I don't know when or how exactly, but we can talk about that as well. What do the organs of authority do? Because and we're talking about not just the police, but also the military. What you tend to have in American law enforcement, like you have in the military, is a lot of just normal people in the ranks of the organization, but at the top, they're corrupt politicians like the rest of the political system. They're very woke, as we say. And the question is, how far down does that control go when things get elemental, when it really becomes clear we're talking about a woke regime against a very substantial plurality of the American people, maybe not a majority anymore, with whom do they side? Because most of the people who go into police work, most of the people who go into the military still are normal, patriotic Americans who think they're serving their country, serving their community, but the people who lead them are not of the same mind. They have a completely different agenda. So I think this is a real open question we need to discuss when everything comes unglued, as I think it will. The reason the Ukraine situation is very important is that the perception of American power globally has domestic consequences as well, just as it did for the Soviet Union when it was clear that the Soviet Union could not maintain itself as its global reach, that helped the system collapse back upon themselves. And right now, the real question, it's been said that the Ukraine struggle is a vital national interest for the Russians. It's a vital, it's an existential struggle for the Russians. If they lose the Ukraine war, the future of the Russian Federation is itself at issue. In a sense, that's true for the West as well, not because the United States has any normal national interest in Ukraine, because we don't, but because the existing political order, the bipartisan political order in Washington, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, is dependent on America's global power, America's global reach, the quest for global hegemony that was launched in the 1990s. If that visibly fails, if that, maybe the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan was a kind of an opening bell for this, if that disastrously fails in Ukraine and it becomes clear that the United States is not the top dog in Europe anymore, what are the consequences then for NATO, which is the showpiece, the crown jewel of the American global empire? And I think that's what these people are afraid of, that if we, the West, lose in Ukraine, if the Russians succeed in whatever their aims are in Ukraine, which, they don't consult either Field Marshal Jatras or Field Marshal Trifković exactly what their plan is going to be.
Alas.
But if they do fail, if the West fails there, that I think they realize that things start coming unglued for the American-dominated, dollar-denominated global system. And that then will have repercussions back in the United States. I think we see already the beginnings of these consequences here in Europe. I think it's a very touching concern for our European friends that now it's no longer necessary to go to Stalingrad to freeze to death, that Germans will soon be able to freeze in the comfort of their own homes. So it's very convenient for everybody. Although I hear it might be a mild winter, so maybe that won't happen.
Now, also, and I can speak from first-hand experience, in all key countries, the focus this winter will be on heating homes.
Yes.
And not on providing fuel for the economy. And so in the immediate short term, there will be no popular backlash, but long-term economic consequences, particularly for Germany and Italy, because not many people realize Italy is the second industrial power of the European Union and not France. But at the same time, from the viewpoint of a global hegemonist in Washington, I think that they could rightfully claim that this past year has gone wonderfully.
I'm not sure they could say wonderfully, but at least they're holding it together, which is all they really need to do right now.
Their success in treating Europe far worse than the Soviet Union had ever treated its own lager. So much so that nobody in Germany dares ask who did it with Nord Stream, and we know who did it. And the only German language medium which dared say cui bono and then express some doubt about the official narrative was the Swiss Weltwoche, but not the Neues Deutschland in Frankfurt or the Neues Deutschland in Munich or the Neues Deutschland in Berlin or the Neues Deutschland in Hamburg.
I mentioned earlier Mercouris, and he's pointed out, and I think correctly, that a lot of times when you have these economic crises, people focus on getting through the winter. And it's not getting through the winter that's the big problem. It's what the hell happens when you get to spring and nothing has been resolved and nothing will be resolved. There's also the suggestion, and as I say, for people who hope that political change will come first to America, I think we've seen that will not happen. Could it conceivably come in Europe? Because in Europe, you can have a situation where a party which was just in the single digits a few years ago becomes the ruling party in a few years. Something that can't happen in America, where a minor party can never really get off the ground and be a contender for power. The problem is that when you look at even opposition parties elsewhere in Europe, who departs from the party line when it comes to global security and specifically right now on the NATO question? Even Ms. Maloney, who was, the great populist and going to do something about immigration, and maybe she will do some good things, is simply not. She's even more militant on the anti-Russian line. What was that private conversation that was recorded where she told Berlusconi to shut up because he had voiced a different opinion about this? So I don't see a pathway between whatever misery the European economies are plunged into a change in leadership, because all the leadership on the horizon is just as bad or worse as the people in power now in terms of being lockstep flunkies of whatever orders they get from Washington.
And those who are seriously counter-cultural and counter-establishment, like the AfD in Germany, are subjected to police control.
Yeah, exactly.
Legally
so.
so.
And again, this reflects the pattern in America now, where we've seen this politicization of the FBI. They don't go after Black Lives Matter. They don't go after the people who burn down cities. They go after some people who have some rhetoric that they say, oh, that sounds racist. Oh, by the way, back to just briefly to our election. It was very significant what President Biden said a few days before the election. He didn't go out there pitching for people's votes. This is the great things we've done during our time in office, why you should vote for us. Instead, he came out with a threat. He said anybody who says that this election is not free and fair and the results are suspect is an insurrectionist, they're a Trump mega, semi-fascist, racist, white nationalist, whatever. That doesn't sound to me like a man who was expecting to lose an election. One of his officials was testifying on Capitol Hill that any election questioning by the American population, these are people who are simply puppets of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians. So we already are seeing this kind of frankly, a witch hunt against dissent in the United States, demonization of dissent. And as Srđa says, you have the same thing in maybe a somewhat different form in Europe, where anybody who departs from the party line, especially on security issues, is considered essentially a traitor. And I don't see how that's going to change unless there's some fundamental collapse in Europe where law and order itself totally breaks down. Maybe something arises from the ashes there. But I don't see how through the normal political processes, no matter how bad things get, and as you point out, they'll give priority to heating homes and things like that. They'll shut down the industries. That means their jobs go along with it. But they can simply subsidize living standards like they did during COVID, where they gave you helicopter money, as we say in America. They just drop money on people. We even today, I don't know how it is here, but even today in America, many people have not gone back to work from COVID because they're not making more money than they did before, but they're making enough money just to get by and they don't care.
Well, at this point, Jim, I think you might wish to comment on what occurred to me over these past few months, that in the aftermath of World War II, the United States needed economically and militarily strong European partners, which is why we had a Marshall Plan. But now the United States doesn't need them. It needs simply consumers who are politically controlled, who are culturally castrated, like the Germans, and who are economically weak. In other words, that whereas in the 50s and the 60s we had the German economic miracle, very decent recovery in all of the other countries. Now they actually want them as supplicants and as neo-colonial subjects.
Well, we're having a discussion about this earlier, is what we want from the Europeans, whether we want a broken Europe. And actually, I don't think that's the case, because remember, for that model to be viable, we would need to have a big productive capacity. And we've been destroying ours as well. In other words, it's not like it's not as though we're in the position to become the big industrial and economic powerhouse, which then is the supplier to a flat on its back Europe.
Well, in the field of energy, this is certainly happening already.
I think that even that is overstated. We simply don't have the amount of LNG, much less the facilities, to be Europe's supplier of energy. So in other words, I don't think these people actually have a long-term plan of where this thing is going. I think they're still living in a fantasy world where they can just throw firebombs everywhere, burn everything down, and somehow expect things will hold together.
Just to skip actually, how important Europe really is for us. We are living here actually.
Yeah.
As I told you, I just came from Sydney. There, I was not really. It's very interesting that literally European studies are being evicted from universities. Nobody's interested in European studies there, and what's happening in Europe. They are very much interested, of course, in America, in Asian studies, China, and so on. Simply, we made some of those. They were very happy that anybody was kind of speaking about that. That actually, like Srđa Trifković, professor, spoke to us that like 20 years ago, Association of European Studies was very strong. Now they are almost non-existent.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, actually, I mean, we are living here. For us, Europe is the center of the world. Globally, from America and from other parts of the world, how important really and how significant Europe nowadays is.
Of course, European studies are by definition racist studies, right? Because mostly white people live here. So it's already racist just to study Europe, don't you think? That's why we need to change Europe and make sure that's not the case anymore. I think going down the list of things, you talk about the European recovery after World War II. If you have a slave, you want him to be healthy and do what you want him to do, right? Having a sick slave doesn't help you all that much. Having Europe that was subjected to American political power. Let's go back a bit. In the middle of the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, the first Cold War ended, there was a real terror in Washington that the Europeans were going to break free of American dominance. There was talk about a European army, which basically meant not that they really need an army, but they don't need NATO anymore.
Common European foreign policy.
All that stuff. Somehow that was squelched. In 2003, when we invaded Iraq with our British, Siamese twin or whatever they are, the French and the Germans would not go along with that. People were talking about the emergence of a Paris-Berlin-Moscow axis. That scared the stuffing out of them in
general
in
household.
And so now I don't know exactly what the mechanisms were, but they got all of Europe back under control. I don't know if there was bribes, blackmail. Of course we have their intelligence and their military totally penetrated. These are not free countries. These are satellites.
But we've seen that as early as March of '92, when the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, Zimmerman, flew to Sarajevo to torpedo the European plan, the Kutileva plan. And it was an eminently successful move and an early indicator of the shape of things.
Or when the UNPROFOR effort was led by British and French troops. Meanwhile, we're flying weapons in to give to the Muslims who are not only killing Serbs, but killing British and French peacekeepers, our own allies. We didn't care. I mean, in fact, maybe it was a positive thing because it shows them who's boss. So, there were various means that were used over those decades where it really looked like the slave was going to escape from the reservation, or if I'm mixing my metaphors here, and we brought him back under control with these controlled politicians that you find throughout Europe, with, I guess, the exception of Viktor Orban, who, of course, is an evil person because he's not pro-democracy, He's only responsible to his own people, not to his masters in Washington. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. I think failing having an obedient and healthy slave, it's better to have an obedient and unhealthy slave. I think this is preferable, but we can live with the latter. What we can't live with is having no slave at all and having him be free of our domination. And if you look at America's global empire, that we need to have Europe under our control, we need to have the Middle East under our control, and we need to have the Pacific Fringe under our control, where we now have our confrontation with the Chinese. None of that is going well at the moment. So working on the assumption that with whatever difference of opinion we may have going on in Ukraine, between what's likely to happen, and politically I tend to listen to Srđa, militarily I tend to listen to Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and his view that the Russians are building up for a major offensive that will be launched sometime when the ground is frozen. It won't necessarily look like, mass tank columns, World War II kind of thing. General Surovikin still says it will be a slow grind, which I personally think is deliberate, that having the Ukrainian state crumble incrementally, and frankly having NATO and the EU crumble incrementally over the course of time is more conducive to Russian interests than simply a quick military victory in Ukraine. We disagree about that. Yes, exactly. So, and like I say, they don't consult either one of us, so they're going to make whatever calculation they're going to make. Could they mess the whole thing up? Yes, they possibly could. Maybe they are doing it. But let's work on the assumption that perhaps that they don't. If NATO and the West loses in Ukraine, then I think the world changes, and these people realize they're running short of options. Which, by the way, it does worry me. All this talk you hear about the Russians using nuclear weapons or a dirty bomb and all of this. When we look at things like the marketplace bombings in Bosnia, we looked at the so-called poison gas attacks in Syria.
In Raqqa.
Raqqa. I do worry very much that these people do have a dirty trick up their sleeves. I mean, as if Nord Stream and Kerch Bridge weren't dirty trick enough. And that something would be used as a pretext to get NATO directly involved. I don't mean that we're not involved already, but directly involved with troops engaged in open combat with the Russians. And we do have elements of the 101st Airborne in both Poland and Romania. There's been talk about sending them into Odessa or into Lvov. Maybe they think they could slip in there quietly and present the Russians with an option of attacking them, which they may be hesitant to do. Other people think that they would not be hesitant to do it. I don't know, but I think there's a real concern that this could turn into a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, which certainly Russia would not welcome. Although militarily, I think they would win that confrontation. So,
but would it not seem more rational simply to keep NATO where it is now, and to continue fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian, and simply continue supplying?
Except that depends on some at least minimal level of viability of the Ukrainian forces, and I think we're getting close to the breaking point where that won't exist anymore. They're talking about drafting women, for crying out loud, at this point.
What we've seen over the past 9 months is also the difficulty that the Russians have in first deciding politically to mobilize at least some portion of their human reserves, and then presenting the whole thing to the nation as what it is, an existential struggle. And you may remember that way back in March, I was already worried about the Yugoslav syndrome, or to be more precise, the
Bosnian Serb
syndrome or Milosevic syndrome of deliberately or by design or not clinching, as you would put it, defeat from the jaws of victory, time and over again. Or taking any advantage militarily and squandering in favor of, now we'll have a political settlement, when of course the other side has no intention of honoring any political settlement. Yes, and I think that danger exists. I think the other way to look at that, though, is that if Russia had begun a partial mobilization and launched a major campaign in Ukraine at the very beginning and told the Russian people this was an existential struggle, I don't think it would have been accepted at that point. I think it is accepted now. You always want to be in a position where you're being pushed by public opinion rather than having to drag it reluctantly along. And if you look at the criticism of the Russian government in Russia today, it's mostly, you're not doing enough. Why are you letting, you need to do more. You need to hit them harder. And I think that's a good position to be in politically, if I were in the Kremlin.
Could I return you back to since you started actually about the foreign politics, and you exactly precisely said that Pacific, Middle East, and South America are not going well for USA.
Yes.
Could you give us a comment, especially what's happening with the Arabs? That's one of the crucial issues. They are not siding, maybe for the first time, with Americans openly. And of course, now the whole Playa Rosa or the Pink Tide returning back in South America, in which you are seeing that this huge effort, which was like 5, 6, 7 years ago, to return back kind of moral doctrine again.
Yeah, with Lula winning again in Brazil.
Lula, Argentina, Colombia, also.
And of course, and also we haven't mentioned China as well, which also fits into all this. Yeah, and also India.
And actually, we had some American colleague here, like when the whole thing started, he said that was very interesting perception. Asking us how does it look here. He said from our perspective, American, the only ones whom we put under our control are Europeans. Nowhere else we do have control nowadays. Could you comment on that?
Well, it's related to what you said earlier about if we're the energy supplier for Europe, which I don't think we can be. As everybody knows, the current global financial economic structure rests on the petrodollar. This cozy arrangement we've had with the Saudis for some decades. That's not looking real good right now because the Saudis are talking about selling energy in some other currency. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some kind of a removal attempt against Mohammed bin Salman and somebody more compliant put on the throne in Riyadh. We've asked the Saudis to pump oil. They refuse to do it. The Emiratis are doing the same thing. And we were talking earlier, I think with Netanyahu back in office and somebody who has a close relationship personally with President Putin, we'll even see the Israelis. The Israelis, our favorite country in the entire world, drifting a little bit away from the United States, or at least hedging its bets a bit. You had some night, remember at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you actually had these idiots in Washington talking to Beijing to say, will you help us put pressure on the Russians? Why in the wide world of sports would they do that? Why would they say, let's help you crush the Russians so that you can then come after us with nobody else to support us at the time? The Chinese, I think the Chinese I hear this all the time, the Chinese are very upset about what the Russians are doing. I think the Chinese are thrilled. I think the Chinese see them starting to drag down the global American empire in which they stand to be a major beneficiary. The Americans have put a lot of effort into the so-called Quad of the Indo-Pacific region. There is no such thing as an Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific region. India, Australia, and Japan and the United States. Japanese, we just asked them to cancel some big Sakhalin energy deal with the Russians. They declined to do that. The Indians refused to play ball altogether. All they talk about is, hey, Russia's been our friend since forever, and they're going to remain our friend. I don't think Washington expected that. And then you mentioned Latin America, which should... Latin America is the perennial stepchild, redheaded stepchild of American policy that we beat and ignore, when it should be our first priority. I mean, if we had any brains, we'd be building our own Belt and Road Initiative through the Western Hemisphere, with not only keeping a lot of these people at home, but help to develop these countries, build infrastructure, all the things the Chinese do in Eurasia. Why don't we do that? Because we would rather beggar our neighbors. We'd rather wreck other people's projects than building anything of significance of our own, including, by the way, in the United States. Where's a high-speed rail system in the United States? Non-existent, and there never will be one, at least under the current setup. So you're right about that. We are seeing the rest of the world not taking an overtly pro-Russian position, but not taking a pro-American position either. And for the Russians and for the Chinese and for the, if you will, the Eurasian bloc against the thalassocratic. By the way, I don't know if these people actually believe in all these Mackinder terms that if we lose the heartland that somehow we're defenseless, because I think we've still got the prospect of a pretty good empire in the Western Hemisphere if we were going to actually, look at things rationally. But since we don't look at things rationally, it's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, but the woke Oceania.
The woke Oceania, yes. There is no transatlanticism without transgenderism. That is the motto of American policy.
Anyone else?
Please join us.
Competition is, all this, there's a little word that I guess it's about competition. How does American business, policy, etc. feel? Do they feel like they can compete or they cannot compete any longer and they're dragging Europe and everybody else behind? Because if you run slower, I can run faster. So where are we?
Well, when we're talking about American business, that's a pretty broad concept.
I've been reading in Saudi Arabia. That was very interesting.
Yeah.
where the business was on one side and the policy was on the other side.
Of course, American manufacturing, we're talking about actual production of real wealth. We have basically manufacturing and agriculture. Agriculture, America is still pretty significant, and we're a big food exporter. Manufacturing, not so much, and that's continually declining in America. A large part of our wealth is fictional wealth. It's digital wealth created by Wall Street and spread around through various financial instruments. It counts in the GDP figures, but it doesn't really amount to actual wealth. That is the sector of the American economy, much more than the other two sectors, that actually has a lot of reach in the American political system. And let's also remember, too, that you think that the real business of a corporation is to make money for its shareholders. Yes, it does that, but you also have a tendency, at least American business, I don't know how it is in Europe, for the executives of the company to treat the company as though it belonged to them and not the shareholders. They have all these incredibly stupid woke policies that are driving, and a lot of them now openly say, we won't hire any white people for positions unless you have to get some major exception to be allowed to do that because you can't find anybody else. That there's been such an integration now between the executive class of major American corporations and the woke tendencies in our government that there's really not any difference between them anymore. This was, by the way, very much accentuated during the whole COVID episode, where you had the pharmaceutical companies and also the media companies, with the social media censorship and so forth, having such a reach into the American government, you could almost speak of it in terms of state capture. Yes, you do have things like the military-industrial complex, but what Eisenhower talked about as the military-industrial complex, 70 however many years ago.
59.
It was a horse and buggy outfit compared to the Formula One racer that constitutes the deep state today, which is not only the military-industrial complex, but the media companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the financial system, and all the rest of it. It's one big nomenclatura of power that has this very bizarre ideology which controls the United States and seeks to control the world.
There is one similarity between today's America and the Soviet Union of yore, which relates to what you just said. Back then, the Soviets would often put Central Asian secretaries general of communist parties in Central Asia and Russians as their deputies, or Central Asian natives as directors of enterprises, but Russians as their deputies doing the real work. And today you have hundreds of black and brown, gay or
transgender, whatever it is,
transgender, lesbian CEOs with white heterosexual males doing the real work.
So what's next? A lesbian prime minister, perhaps?
Well, wow, Serbia will never accept.
Yes. So, or any other thoughts out here? Yes.
My name is Ivan from Serbia and MFA, but I'm private here. I will just to ask the question about the conflict, Russian NATO. Actually, it's more Russian NATO than Russia-Ukraine conflict in Ukraine. We know that that's some sort of lose-lose position for both sides.
Mm-hmm.
But the United States, Western Europe is now in, let's say, some underdog position, and Russia, of course, is also under sanctions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to ask you how much that conflict, how much USA can make a profit of it, how much US can gain from that one. Since it turns back the role of US in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
like it was the case in Yugoslav wars in the 90s, when NATO was, there was no purpose of existing NATO. They should turn back some conflict in order to justify their existence. how much U.S. can gain from it, especially in economically, having in mind that now is demand for LNG or other energetic resources in big demand from the U.S. side. They can make a big profit. So can it stabilize American economic situation and also stabilize U.S. as a power?
I don't think so. To start with, could a direct conflict between NATO and Russia stabilize the United States in some way, either economically or politically? I don't think so. To start with, if there is a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, again, we may disagree about this, but everything I've heard from my sources is that NATO would lose that war. NATO would lose that war if it were a conventional war. All this talk that Russia's desperate is going to go nuclear, it's not the Russians would go nuclear. It's the Americans would go nuclear if we were going to lose that war. And unfortunately, any direct large-scale clash between NATO and Russia does run the risk that it would turn nuclear, in which case we don't have to worry about any of this stuff because we'll all be dead. So there's good news there. But if there is some kind of, let's say, escalation of the conflict short of total nuclear annihilation, I don't see how that would really benefit the United States. Sure, some industries would make some money, but you have to understand that the military base, there was a paper written, I'm trying to think of the Royal Institute of Strategic Studies, a few months ago, was saying the United States today simply does not have the industrial capacity to fight an industrial scale war.
Royal United Services.
Yes, that's it. Yes. So it's the mother of the one we went to in India. Remember with General Nambiar. Which is the country that really has the industrial capacity to fight that war? It's not the United States. It's China. And to fight a major global war, which is like, say, World War II, dependent on industrial capacity, does not put us in a good position. Doesn't put Europe in a good position, especially if they're starved for energy. As far as LNG and things like that, yeah, there may be some American business executives that are slobbering with anticipation. We're going to sell a lot of expensive, environmentally hazardous LNG to Europe, for which the facilities don't exist yet and will take years to build, and begging the question whether we have the capacity to export that much gas at all, much less in the very near term. So I don't see how anybody thinks they're going to pull a rabbit out of their hat and say, oh, we have a big war, selling a lot of weapons and a lot of gas is really going to have America rolling in money. Some people will make some money, but war profiteers always exist. But it tends not to work out well for the profiteers if you're on the losing side of the war.
Socratic dialogue, please.
Okay, so tell us where we're wrong.
Tell me. My name is Branislav, University of Novi Sad, faculty of law and professor of criminal law. Internal tensions in the United States, are they strong enough, for example, to cause great problems in comparison with problems throughout the world? For example, tension between races and between classes in society.
Yes, I'm glad you volunteered that, because we do have many criminals running things in America, so a criminal justice background would be appropriate. I think where we're, when I was here 2 years ago, my talk was on the question, does the United States have a future? My presentation was short. No, I'll take your questions. Okay, then you asked me to elaborate a little bit. And I've given 2 talks at the Ron Paul conference in the last couple of years. The first one was called It's Later Than You Think, from Father Seraphim Rose. And then my update a few months ago was It's Even Later Than You Thought. And I think what's likely to happen is that just as the perestroika and glasnost efforts of Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union to try to revamp and somehow revitalize the Soviet system ended up destabilizing, first in Eastern Europe, then where all the little Brezhnevs were removed and replaced by little Gorbachev reformers, and then communism became unviable there. But then when the wave came back and then struck the metropolis from which it had originated, I think we're likely to see something like that if, as I think is likely, the American empire does come crashing down in some form over the next few years, maybe sooner than we think. It's going to hit Europe first. Europe's economy and Europe's social cohesion will decline first very sharply, but then I think when that wave comes back and hits the United States, it will be even more devastating. And we will go through something in the United States comparable to what the Soviet Union went through in the 1990s. The trouble is that in some ways we're even less able to go through that in some kind of fairly peaceful fashion as the Soviet Union did. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union was relatively peaceful as global events go. It won't be in the United States.
Now is the moment to come back to the role of the military, the police, and
yes,
the security
exactly. So, in other words, unlike the Soviet Union, which whatever its faults and however unviable some of these ridiculous borders are, including, it turns out, Ukraine's, we don't have anything comparable to that in the United States. Very few of our states are viable countries. Texas, perhaps, maybe Florida, not California. And then the rest, all the square things in the middle, no such luck. The real divisions in America are not so much between state and state, but within the, as we say, blue cities and red countryside, where, as I like to say, in 1861, Americans, North and South, read the same Bible, they prayed to the same God, they honored the same founding fathers, they claimed fidelity to the same principles of government. We don't even agree on our pronouns or what a woman is. And so we are aliens to one another. We hate each other. We are enemies now. And increasingly everybody knows this, but then we're locked in this fiction that somehow we have the rule of law and a constitution that we all agree on, when in fact we don't. And so what happens, and this is where I get, and you mentioned like the racial question. In Serbia, I think, and I hope, most Serbs still know they're Serbs. Most Germans, or maybe many Germans, still know they're Germans, Englishmen, so, yeah, that's right. In America, even the core American ethnos, the people, the state founding people, which are essentially European, Christian, English speakers who founded America, have been convinced they don't exist as a nation, that they've been convinced that America is a civic state, not an ethnic state, or that we're a proposition nation, a nation of immigrants, the embryo of a global nation, all of this stuff. So when the supply chains break down, when the food deliveries haven't gone to our big cities for a week and they erupt, they collapse in chaos and arson and looting, who do these people think they are? Well, I'm for my Constitution. Well, the Constitution is not an ethnos. I guess I'm white. Well, okay, fine. Your physical descent is part of who you are, but it's not the whole thing. Your language, your religion, all these things that make a culture are part of what a nation is.
The term white nationalism is absurd.
Yeah, because we hear sometimes from people who do have a racial consciousness, which are actually a very small fringe of the American population, that they need a white ethno-state. Well, white is not an ethno-state. There are white ethnoi, there's Germans and Serbs and Spaniards and so forth. There are yellow ethnoi, Koreans and Japanese. There are black ones, Yoruba and Xhosa and all sorts of other people. But so when things get, as you say, kinetic or elemental, we don't really know what happens. These people don't know who they are. I must say that's one reason why I focus less personally on national politics. I don't care who runs Washington, D.C. anymore. I don't even care who runs Richmond. I care who runs Spotsylvania County. It's a rural county in Virginia. And that's why I'm sort of trying to be as survivable as possible, as Srđa knows. And a lot of people around me are the same.
Clips which I can show you.
It's so the long and the short of it is that it will have an impact on the outside world, but in some sense it may involve a severe withdrawal of America from the outside world, which maybe would not be a bad thing because we're going through our own internal crisis. How much influence did Russia have on the outside world while they were busy falling apart domestically? Not much. Now, does it mean we won't recover again as a nation at some point? Maybe we will, but that means there had to be some recovery of some kind of functional American identity at some future point. And that probably will only happen in part of what is now the United States, not all of it. Yes?
Do you think there will be possible some kind of civil wars in America?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, where this is going is that, but it won't be, and this is back to what Srđa was saying about the police and the army. It won't be a nice, neat thing with lines of blue and gray shooting at each other. It'll be more like Bosnia or more like Lebanon or something like that, where localities, neighborhoods, streets, communities are facing off against whoever else. There'll be looters. There'll be people trying to find food.
We had example in Japan where 200,000 people were evacuated after Fukushima. Not a single case of burglary. And then Katrina in New Orleans 17 years ago, where we immediately had a Hobbesian state of nature.
Exactly. And we even saw, what was it? It was like 40 or 50 years ago when the lights went out in New York City for just a few hours, and you had looting all over the place. And when we already see, as I described earlier, people thinking that they're immune from criminal responsibility now looting places, and things haven't even collapsed. What happens when they do collapse? And this gets back to, what do the organs of authority, what do the organs of coercion do when this happens? First off, if it gets bad enough, they're going to say, well, hell with this, I got to go home and take care of my own family. And they're going to worry about their own skin and their own people, not about what some order is somebody gives them. But you also have the problem that, and this is part of the Anglo-Saxon mentality, regular Americanos are very law-abiding. And you very well may get a situation where the police or the military, or right now what we see the FBI doing with their raids on opponents of the Biden regime, saying that these people are traitors, these people are puppets of the Russians and the Chinese, these people are white supremacists, blah, 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 blah. And even though those are their own people, they will act to repress them. Now, I can't help but think of the Russian Civil War, where again you had a similar thing between the countryside and the cities, where often the cities were controlled by the Bolsheviks, the countryside was not. How did they feed the cities? They sent punitive detachments out to the countryside to seize food. Can this regime do that with punitive detachments of trannies and feminists and illegal aliens? I'm not sure they have the wherewithal to do that. They would have to convince enough ordinary core Americans to be the enforcers of what's left of a woke order against their own fellows. I don't know if they can do that or what the split will be.
But Jean Raspail certainly predicted half a century ago that this would happen in France, even though it is even less of a likely candidate for such an act of betrayal of your own people by the security forces.
But on the other hand, you've also had in France, not too long ago, some warnings from French generals warning of the possibility of a civil war in France. Unlike Germany, the French army still is a significant factor in the French nation. Our army is, to a great extent, although it's been kind of rotted a bit by some of the woke policies. So there's a lot of question marks here. I don't think we know the answers.
Two connected stuff. First, you're returning all the time to the woke madness.
Yes.
Which is definitely when you perceive what is happening around. If the people don't follow here, for example, they have included that, as we used to go to school, we had like sports sections, then biology or whatsoever. Today in USA you have LGBTQ plus sections, in which 80% of the kids are more or less forced, because otherwise they're racist, they're homophobic, whatsoever. So my question is really how spread it is. Srđa already said, and you said actually that the whole, like the especially big tech companies and like the Hollywood and so on. But when you speak about, let me say, general population in USA, how deeply entrenched or spread is it? And especially among the young elite, if I could say, that's one thing. And the other one connected with the role of the constitutional, I return to your constitution, Supreme Court of Justice, actually. And how, especially after the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, and the way it was overthrown, because the whole idea was to turn down the idea, that I will not go deeply about the idea of privacy, actually, on which that explanation was very important, because it is in a way plaidoyer for also Overgear versus Hodges and many other those kinds. What might be happening in the future, or could this bring to some kind of deeper division, even civil
Yeah.
resurrection and so on.
Yeah.
Because at this moment, Democrats are trying to delegitimize Supreme Court of Justice and saying that it is political institution,
Yeah, yeah.
and it was not when they were in
Yeah.
power there and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, I mean, as far as that decision goes, very briefly, nobody with any sense of constitutional integrity ever thought the Roe decision had any legs to it at all. Even people who were in favor of legal abortion would say they knew it was total constitutional fiction. Total constitutional fiction. There was nothing behind it. It's only through an accident that Donald Trump was able to appoint enough justices, and Mitch McConnell was able to get them through the Senate that would overturn it and return it to what the constitutional thing would be, that ordinary police powers, as it's called, belong to the states, and the states will do whatever they want to do on this matter, which was the case before Roe. The fact that ordinary constitutional processes are considered an extraordinary usurpation of the Constitution by half of the country, it tells you how bad the whole notion of constitutional government is. So the fact that a certain level of Anglo-Saxon by-the-book rectitude may have manifested itself belatedly in one area is not going to save the system in any way. As far as the wokeness goes, it's hard to tell. It's what, something like 20% of college kids nowadays identify themselves as some letter on the rainbow spectrum somewhere.
Not as a straight male.
Exactly. And of course, you see so much of this. You know, Russia is evil, by the way, because they have this law against propagandizing LGBT to children. We do that in America. You know, you see on Americans' cartoon channels for children things like, oh, look at all the families. Oh, here's a non-binary family. Here's two mommies. Here's two daddies. This is aimed at children. It's aimed at children. It's, you know, somebody was talking about it's the bachabazi culture of Afghanistan coming to America now, where you have these events where men dressed up as women, little boys dressed up, drag kids, and all. I mean. Now, this doesn't happen everywhere in America, but it does happen, and there's no pushback against it. You know, I'd like to think in some countries, if you were to do that, pardon?
Why there is no push?
Because it gets back to what I said earlier about American law abidingness. Is that you know, what the pushback would be? A bunch of fathers would go over there and beat the crap out of them. You know, that would be the normal human response to something like that. You don't put up with something like that. You know, why isn't there a Cossack with a nagaika around when you really need one?
And also,
you know?
because there are even consequences for one's life.
You will be crushed. In other words, if you were to do in any way push back on that, much less if you were to do it violent, where you go to jail for a long time, if you even criticize, argue against it, you're the racist, homophobe, white nationalist, blah, blah, blah. You'll be fired from your job and so on. So your bank accounts will be closed, all of these things. So it's hard to know, in some ways, and of course many people who grew up in communist countries tell us now in America what an eerie sense of familiarity it's bringing, but even worse in many ways, because the moral pressure is much stronger than the fear of being sent to a jail or a camp somewhere.
It's been 20 years since I actually had that question asked. Why was it better under communism? Well, because even for a party secretary of a party cell, it was possible to come home in Poland or in Serbia or in Moscow itself to have a couple of drinks, relax, and become a normal person. And the apostles of wokedom are not normal at any moment in time. Yeah. And at the same time, on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, the state, by and large, never penetrated the society because it used the carrot and the stick. It used Pavlovian methods of control.
That we use Freudian methods,
And you use Freudian methods of deep penetration of the psyche, which works.
Yeah, it does. And
private is political, which never came to the communist societies, and that's why Eastern Europe is strongly opposing it.
And that's why even within the same country, former GDR, in Germany, you have normal people. And you know.
Well, actually, if you look at maps on social attitudes of European countries, it looks like the Iron Curtain's still there, because the eastern part is still much more conservative in many respects than the western part.
Sorry, you have very clear. giving lectures in Argentina and Australia on that about the Istanbul Convention, which is I wonder if you know the document. It is actually pillar document of Council of Europe putting everything inside gender. It's allegedly for the prevention of the family violence, but it is completely law-based and so on. And you see clear Iron Curtain in which all, even actually United Kingdom for a very long time, because of the immigration, but some other stuff, avoided to ratify and apply that actually. And now when they pushed Boris Johnson, finally they also ratified that.
He's a conservative, you know.
But in a way he had to stick upon that because actually Brexit was mainly because of allegedly immigration. But in Eastern Europe, there are still 8 countries. 2 countries didn't sign that at all, Russia and Azerbaijan. 8 countries didn't ratify that, and even those who ratified, there are very big problems in implementation. So it's actually, and guess what? The only condition that Ukraine had to fulfill to get candidacy for European Union was what? To ratify the Istanbul Convention, which they, with huge majority, refused to do in 2016. Sorry for just...
So back to the answer to the question, I don't know how deep it is, but it is deep. Is it a majority? I don't think it is like a majority even in the population as a whole, but it's in a majority in some sectors in some cities and other places less so. Again, I think a lot of this is country versus city division, but not a direct correlation. Yes.
But how is it, for example, when you apply for passport in America and filling out male, female, is there more possibilities?
I don't know if they've changed that yet. I can't believe it will take
other.
They have other. Oh, they have other now? Okay,
They do have other.
Yeah, so, and of course even that is kind of discriminatory because it elevates male and female above all the other 65 possible combinations. So maybe 65? They just... Yeah, well,
you hater.
I'm sorry, only say, that's right, that was only 65 last week. I'm sorry, I'm an evil person. I'm not sufficiently woke. So maybe they just should have sex, put something there, whatever you like. And
they now call it gender.
Yeah. Well, that's right, gender. That, and that's the other thing that has to help strike you too, is just how incredibly stupid all of this is. I mean, they don't even use words right, gender and sex. It's just annoying, really.
Yeah, well, equally, 60 years ago, it was incredibly stupid that workers' self-management was based upon a mechanism whereby it will no longer be the case that surplus value is extracted from labor and kept by the owners of the means of production and blah, blah. But it resulted in the physical liquidation of millions of human beings.
Yeah.
On that cheerful note,
we should wait on that.
on this cheerful note, maybe we can start considering.
Just one thing, Jim, you mentioned St. Father Seraphim Rose. You didn't mention Southern Baptists. You didn't mention Catholics. You didn't mention anybody in this whole topic that we're talking about, election, etc. 10 years ago or so, I mean, they were like in the forefront. People would discuss where they go, what's happening, how much of influence. Where are they? What happened?
That's a great question. In fact, the degree of religious resistance to this in America has declined precipitously. There is no Jerry Falwell figure. There's still Franklin Graham, but I don't think he's really, all that visible in any of this. I'm sure many of you people have heard of Rod Dreher, who writes for the American Conservative Orthodox. He's talking about what he calls the Benedict option, where people essentially are going to have to retire. He's not saying disengage from society, but you're going to have to try to preserve values in smaller communities. And you do hear a lot of people talking this way. I don't really see that much happening along those lines. I think there are a lot of problems with the whole concept as Rod lays it out. But I think to some extent, one thing at least we do have in America is like, you can send your kids to a private school, Christian school. All my grandkids go to a private school, but that means also then you're conceding the public schools to the enemy. That I'm very involved in the school board in my county because we just got narrowly elected a conservative majority on the county, which now is trying to push back against some of these things. But you can't help but feel that it's a bit of a losing fight. that the trend is in the other direction. I'd like to think that at some point in the future that Orthodoxy is part of the solution to whatever future America emerges into at some point.
But you need to mention the problems with Orthodoxy.
Yes, and there are problems with Orthodoxy in America. We have this attempts through some of the, especially academics in some of the universities, mostly Orthodox studies centers at Catholic universities, to try to change the teachings of Orthodoxy in the way that's already destroyed the Protestant denominations and has all but destroyed the Roman Catholic Church. At the same time, we do have, like many, like the parish I go to in Virginia, it's about 80% ethnic Americans, and of the other 20%, about even Greeks and Russians, and the rest, few Serbs, few Romanians. You do have an awful lot of Americans on the religious front who are looking for something authentic, and they know they're not going to find it in the Protestant denominations. They're not going to find the Roman Catholic Church, especially with the current Pope there. And so frankly, I think we should make Pope Francis an Orthodox saint. He sent more Roman Catholics to Orthodoxy than we can possibly count in America. So it's
That reminds me of who was the greatest Scottish patriot of all time?
Who?
General Sir Douglas Haig.
He killed more Englishmen.
Anyway, when
Yes.
you came to the religious issues, actually, how, let me say, put it bluntly, how woke Catholics are today in America?
There's a real split. There are many conservative Catholics. I have a very good friend who's Roman Catholic, and he goes to the traditional Latin Mass, which has a following in the United States. And look, it's very inspiring when you go there. You see a packed church. You see a lot of families with young children there, women with their heads covered, very conservative. But I don't think that's a big proportion of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's big enough that Pope Francis feels he needs to crush it, and by basically all but outlawing the traditional Mass for Roman Catholics. I hate to say it, that's probably good for us, because some of those people will come to us, not for the right reasons, by the way. I don't think that's necessarily a reason to abandon the church you were raised in. But there are some people who think this is still a bastion of tradition, and other people who see it's sort of the Father James Martin, S.J., gay church with rainbow banners in the Catholic churches.
Like you.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, you see with the German bishops and things like that, the Pope obviously not really disciplining them in the way he's capable of doing. Look, if there's any advantage to the Roman Catholic model, we'd like to say in Orthodoxy, the devil can never subvert the church because he can't figure out the organization chart. Whereas in the Roman Catholic Church, one guy's in charge. And I understand the Curia is a big bureaucracy, it's hard to move it and all that, but he has a lot of authority. That's supposed to be their big ace in the holes, that when things are down, the Pope can make a decision. He's the decider. Well, he seems to be very selective with what decisions he wants to make. Again, that's their problem.
It used to be said of the Church of England that it was the Tory party at prayer.
Yeah.
And today it's the social workers at group therapy.
There's no.
Can you tell us something about the importance of the increase of the number of Latin Americans in the United States? I mean, this relates
Yes.
to the Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, that's a big topic. I would say that it has a number of different impacts. There are many first off, there are a lot of what we saw, Hispanics is a very diverse community, depending on what country they come from. Like, for example, in Florida, the Cubans historically voted Republican because they were more anti-communist. They're mostly fleeing Castro. I think the Democrats generally look at them as a great base of their political support, because since their whole way of approaching American tribalism, if you will, is to say whitey is bad. Anybody who can be put on the anti-white team is a big plus. In fact, there's a move now to try to take Middle Easterners and South Asians out of the default white category and make a separate minority category for them so they can join Team Hate Whitey. That hasn't really
Or
materialized.
get a bigger slice.
Yeah, get a bigger slice of the pie. On the other hand, some Hispanics, because they are Christians, and not all of them Catholics, by the way, very many increasingly Hispanics, immigrants, or their children gravitate to other churches, especially evangelical Protestant churches. So sometimes they become then very religious, very conservative, and then tend to vote more conservatively as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag with Hispanics. On the whole, it's I don't think it's probably, it is a loss for the traditional definition of America, because even if when Americans, the Republicans increase their share of the Hispanic vote, it's still a minority of the vote. And there's still, frankly, more benefits to being on the anti-side than on the pro-side of preserving what was left of America. So that's an attraction that is very hard for a lot of people. But at the same time, though, you also have a very strong work ethic among most of the Hispanic migrants who come to the United States and say, look, I don't want to burn down the neighborhood. My cousin Gustavo boxes groceries there. It's so why do I want to burn the place down?
Shelby?
No, one more. Yeah.
Iran, situation in Iran and election.
Yes.
Estimate and will be changed in the future.
The next election in 2024 or the current one? The next election in 2024? Well, first off, Trump is supposed to make an announcement on the 15th. Almost certainly he will announce that he's running again. The Democrats will do everything possible to stop him from running. There's an act that was passed after the Civil War to stop insurrectionists from running for office. So I think a lot of this talk about the January 6th insurrection is aimed at him. They're trying to get a hold of his tax records, anything they can find to keep him from running. Where I live, there's still a very huge Trump cult of personality. You drive through the countryside, Trump flags flying everywhere. A lot of this is based, I'm not trying to be critical here, but on a kind of a naive assumption that he did all the things he said he would do when he was in office. His re-election slogan was, promises made, promises kept. What was his signature promise? To build the wall on the Mexican border. If you ask a lot of his supporters, they think he did that. They think he actually built that wall. Well, he didn't. That's why we have hundreds of thousands of people coming across all the time. So on the other hand, he clearly terrifies the establishment, and I don't think they're so much afraid of him as they are afraid of what's left of the American narod, the American ethnos that supports him. That's what they're terrified of, and they see that he's kind of like a avatar of these deplorable evil people who are supposed to be thrown into the ash heap of history, and they don't want to be thrown in the ash heap. He's their guy. How that plays out, I don't know. I can see that if he were to be elected in 2024, that the country would explode. Because remember, the left can burn down anything they want, and they won't have to be held with impunity, not be legally accountable, and they will do it if he is elected. He will find the country ungovernable, adding to the fact that he'll probably make all the same mistakes he made the first time around by appointing a bunch of regular Republicans to his administration who side more with his opponents than they do with the things that he's running on. Plus, he really hurt himself during the COVID period by going along with the whole Anthony Fauci lockdown, masking, and the vax. You see him at his rallies, I'm the one who brought you the vax, Operation Warp Speed. He gets booed by his own supporters. He doesn't seem to realize that he's giving them a gift they didn't want to have. So I think we're looking at potential chaos in 2024.
What about DeSantis?
I don't know what to make of DeSantis, and I see now with some polling that it's sort of split even between Trump and DeSantis. You have some people who say, I wish we could have Trumpism without the Trump. We could have populism without having this guy. Look, the thing about Trump, his virtues and his vices are the same qualities. The things people love him for are the things people hate him for. They would like to have a nice, clean fingernail, polite, well-mannered Trump instead of the Trump we have. The trouble with DeSantis is, and maybe I'm wrong about this and being unfair, maybe I shouldn't say it, he kind of strikes me like Maloney in that he will do and say some good things about some issues, maybe some important ones like immigration, but when it comes to the key ones about maintaining the empire and the war policy towards so much of the rest of the world, he'll probably go right down the line on that, and that's what they really care about.
So we need Tucker, DeSantis, Trump.
Though you can't have three on a ticket together.
No, I'm talking about the persona, the composite persona.
For Iran.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, what in Russia they said in the 1990s they needed
Joseph.
Adolf Vissarionovich Pinochet. So we don't have.
So could you comment on Iran?
Pardon?
Iran.
Oh, what? Iran. Yeah, well, I saw recently we were doing more air provocations against Iran recently, just to show them that the Saudis were supporting them and the Israelis. Although there have been indications that maybe even the Saudis would like to try to improve their relationship with Iran. With Netanyahu coming back, I guess we could probably expect the heat on that to turn up a little bit. And the question is, there's always the discussion in Washington, if the United States won't do something overtly hostile to Iran, would the Israelis do it on their own? I don't think the Israelis would do anything to Iran on their own, or even capable of doing it without very strong U.S. support. So there still would have to be a decision in Washington to take any kind of strong military action against Iran. I saw a report recently that even the United States intelligence agencies concede Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. So what the imperative for this would be, I don't know. But it's unfortunately, as long as Iran is a kind of a boogeyman for the Israelis, that means it's a boogeyman for the United States. If the world situation, as it seems to be going, though, in favor of Eurasia, and of course we see with Iran entry into the Shanghai Security Organization, so we're being integrated into the Eurasian bloc. I think that it's not an overt alliance. Russia and China are not going to come to Iran's assistance, but I think it does give Iran some degree of protection.
All things, including good ones, have to come to an end.
Okay.
Tomorrow at 10:45, those who haven't had enough of James Jatras can
Including
see him on Happy TV.
No, not just Happy TV. That's on Maric's program.
Yes.
Was that Happy TV?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize what
It's
that
called,
was.
it's called
I thought it was
Good Morning Serbia.
I thought it was
and,
Unhappy TV. I don't know.
I will be there to translate,
Yes.
but also to intervene to make sure that Maric doesn't interrupt him too much. So, thank you for your
Thank you.
attention.
Thank you.